Okay, well, thank you to the Palouse Conservation District and to everyone joining us tonight. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk with all of you guys, although it'd be more fun to be in person and to be visiting the beautiful Palouse country, which I really enjoy. But I look forward to doing as much as we can online here and providing you with a good experience. So we're going to be talking about pasture management for horses and all livestock. And I know I often become horse-centric. So if there's anything that I miss for other livestock and you guys have questions, let's be sure to cover them at the end. And I'll look forward to doing that. So what I'm going to do first is start out with a little bit of introduction, a little bit more introduction about my background, because it's different than what we normally see in, and now it doesn't want to advance. Let's see. There, I don't know what that was. My background is different than what you see a lot of times in classes like this, so I like to just kind of review it real quickly. I've been working in this field of horses and livestock and land management for about 30 years. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology and biology, and then a graduate degree in communications, and then I've studied a lot in the fields of natural resources and in equine science and range management. And I work primarily with natural resource agencies. I kind of act as the go-between between what people look at as like government and the landowner, the horse owner, livestock owner. And an interesting thing, perhaps to all of you guys, is that I started out working in King County in the Seattle area, and I worked there for I worked on staff for the King Conservation District for about 6 years before I formed my own business, Horses for Clean Water, and then I contracted back to the King CD as well as other conservation districts around Puget Sound, and then eventually that expanded to other parts of Washington state and then to other states and across the country. So my husband and I were both horse people, and we compete in reining and ranch riding and ranch trail. I've been riding and horsing around for my whole life, basically. And we live in southwestern Idaho now. We lived in Washington for 30 years in the Puget Sound area. I want to share just a little bit about our place because I hope that maybe it might inspire some of you guys who are on small acreage and maybe looking at some other ways to make a little bit of income off of your land and with your animals. And what we do, besides having our own horses here and boarding, is that we also do what I consider to be ecotourism. So that means that we manage our land in a way that it's in concert with the environment. And we have that as the main driving principle for all of the things that we do at our property. And we hope that that's what ends up attracting people to our property. So we have a horse motel, and that's for people who are traveling with horses. You need a place to stay when you have horses and you're traveling. So we have a horse-friendly, eco-friendly horse motel. And then we have a glamping tent for human travelers. And then we also have RV hookup for living quarters or for RVs as well. And then my husband teaches lessons and does clinics, and we do different kinds of retreats, educational retreats on these topics that we're talking about, as well as on other topics that Matt teaches. So, and then altogether, Matt and I have had 3 different horse properties. So 2 in Western Washington. One was a small one on less than an acre. The second one was 10 acres. And this one here in southwestern Idaho is 30 acres. And so it's kind of a diverse climates between the 3 and different kinds of situations as far as like wetlands and forest. And then here we're in the basically in the desert, in the steppe desert dryland area. So it's a lot of similarities to the Palouse. So horses for clean water, people ask what this is, but the bottom line is that we're trying to take care of water quality and really the whole natural world around us, as well as taking good care of our horses and livestock. So we develop classes and farm tours, workshops, education materials. I do individual consultations, and it's all on nature-based solutions for taking care of livestock and land. So the clean water part refers to the fact that runoff from muddy horse properties or from overgrazed horse pastures or manure piles, that they can all cause issues. They can cause livestock health issues. Different kinds of parasites and pathogens live and breed in these kind of muddy conditions. And they can also cause farm productivity issues because you have less pasture, and so you're going to have to buy more hay, and you have maybe more weeds, and you could have vet bills and horse health or livestock health issues if they're toxic weeds. And then the runoff that comes from mud and from manure or from overgrazed pastures can cause water quality issues. And that's where the clean water part comes in, and horses for clean water, because with the runoff, you're going to get nutrients and sediments from manure and from mud, and that can leach into your groundwater and can cause issues for your well if you're on a well, or it can get into the surface water and cause problems for creeks and ponds and wetlands and the fish and riparian life that live in those areas. So we're just trying to target all of that and look for a win-win-win way of keeping horses and livestock that's going to be good for everybody, good for animal health, good for chore efficiency, good for the productivity of your property, good for the aesthetics of your neighborhood. Hopefully it's going to save you money because you'll have more productive pastures and less vet bills. And then it's going to be good for our natural world around us because it's conserving our natural resources. Okay, so let's start talking about pasture management. And the way I like to start out my talks is to talk about some of the problems associated with not having a pasture management program. And in this picture here, sometimes we'll see this. Hopefully we don't see it too much, but in this situation here, really it's not much of a pasture. It's more of a heavy use area or confinement area, even though I'm sure that these landowners think that or refer to it as a pasture. But the grass is so short that when it rains or when they irrigate, all you're going to be doing is flushing off the manure in that field, manure and urine. So that's nutrients and sediments from that, as well as valuable topsoil. And we're going to be learning tonight that if you want to be growing pasture, you need that valuable topsoil. And actually you need the nutrients in the manure and the urine, and you want them to stay there and to nourish your plants and not to get washed off into the surface water. So another problem with not having a pasture management plan is that your property ends up looking unsightly, and your neighbors may or may not appreciate it. In this picture, there are older houses around these overgrazed pastures and bare ground and manure piles. But as I'm sure is happening to in the Palouse region, there's so much development going in now, and that development and the people in those areas, they may think that they want the rural lifestyle, but they may not be as tolerant of things like odors and flies and runoff as we as livestock owners think that they should be. So there's that concern with not having a pasture management plan in place. And then there's weeds. And when you have overgrazed pastures, or another way to look at it is, if you look at this picture here, at some time of the year, this might look pretty because it's so green. But if you inspect it a little more carefully, you'll notice that there's really no grass in it, no grass blades. It's really just all yellow plants, yellow flowers. So what's happened here is that the equines in this situation have selectively grazed all of the grass down to the ground, and what's thriving is all weeds. So if you don't have a pasture management in place, this can happen real easily, where basically all you end up with is weeds. And then overgrazing, when you have a situation like this, you can see that the grass is, not even as tall as the cattle's hooves in these pictures. And when you have a severely overgrazed pasture, your animals are going to end up pulling up the grass plants by the roots and destroying the integrity of the pasture, and then ingesting the soil and the part of the plant that's highest in sugars, which for horses can be an issue. And in fact, I call the short pastures like this a candy bar pasture, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. But the reason why I do that is because the grass plant stores its carbohydrates, its non-structural carbohydrates, which are the sugars, in the bottom 2 to 3 inches of the grass plant. And so they are actually the tastiest part of the grass plant, but it's all sugar. And if you don't want to end up with a chunky individual like this one in the picture here, who's basically all pudgy all the way around, you don't want to have them on an overgrazed pasture, because that's where the most amount of sugar is. But we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. So another problem that I like to bring up about not having a pasture management plan in place actually has to do with climate change. And I think it's a really important one to visit, particularly in this talk, this day and age. And the problem with an overgrazed pasture like in this picture is that dark ground absorbs more sunlight than lighter ground. So it means it's in the summertime, it's going to dry out that ground a lot faster because it's absorbing the heat from the sun, making it hotter, requiring more irrigation, which is always it's going to be a problem if you're in a time where it's droughty. Particularly a problem in that kind of a situation. And if you have grass like this is actually helping to solve the problem of climate change. So good pasture cover shades the ground, keeps it cool, helps it retain moisture, and the pasture plants are photosynthesizing. And when they're doing that, they're actually pulling out carbon from the atmosphere. We call it sequestering carbon, and they're storing it in their roots. So they're capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in their roots. So that's literally helping with, this picture here is helping with reducing climate change. And I like to point this out to people and give people this thought. So this is a map I got from Bloomberg. It was actually in a golfing magazine. They were trying to talk about defending golf courses and how much land they use and water they use. But I thought it was a great map because it shows, you know, it gives you a general idea of how much land horses and cattle and livestock have in the United States. And I'd like to just propose the thought that if most of the land looked like that or like that, which is going to be better for climate change. And obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on reducing climate change if we have this situation where we've got grass plants keeping the ground cool, conserving moisture, and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So my paradigm shift that I offer to people is to realize that you can actually be part of the change in our small little way. Each of us can be part of the change and part of making a difference if we have grassy pastures on our property. So the water quality part, we're still just have a couple more points, or one more point here about why having a pasture management plan is important. And the last point I want to make is that it's very important to have pasture for water quality concerns. So you'll notice from my pictures that they're all over the country, really. And that's because because the audience, our audience, you know, tonight could literally be anywhere, but also because I like to show to people that these problems and these issues, they're not just in your county, they're not just, you know, in the Palouse area, they're not just in my area in Idaho. You know, it's a worldwide issue, and we each need to embrace that and do what we can to make a change. And so this picture is actually in Utah, and this pasture is severely overgrazed, and they have a water body in the foreground and manure pile and bare ground in the background. And, you know, when it rains or when the snow melts, the runoff's going to run towards this water body. And all water bodies drain to some other bigger water body. And as they do that, they carry the pollution basically from this pasture, because there's not grass there to utilize the nutrients or to slow them down and to stop them from getting into the water body. So pasture management is huge as far as keeping water clean and protecting our water quality. And the bottom line for a lot of natural resource agencies is protecting wildlife and fish and shellfish and riparian animals. Those are the animals that live along creeks and the shorelines of ponds and wetlands. They're often what we call the indicator species, and they indicate the health of the environment. And salmon are the indicator species in the Pacific Northwest. So they tell us about the health of the environment. And we know that in the Pacific Northwest that their numbers are dwindling. And there's many reasons why, but one of them is because of non-point pollution. So whatever we can do as livestock owners to help reduce pollution that's potentially running into our water bodies is very important. So on the other hand, for all of us as horse and livestock owners, a healthy pasture is going to provide us with a lot of wonderful benefits. It provides natural exercise and mental health outlets for our animals. It's a high quality, nutritious diet. It decreases our hay bill because it's saving us money. It's a pleasing picture for all of us. This looks so much better than that overgrazed pasture we were looking at. Plus, it prevents soil erosion because when you have healthy pastures with long roots, they hold that soil in place. And then those grass plants, the actual plants themselves and their roots are going to filter out the nutrients from manure and urine and put them to good use. And a healthy pasture is going to help reduce the effects of climate change. So there's all these good reasons to have pasture management in place. So let's talk about how to do that. And all of it starts with becoming what I call a grass farmer. And just for tonight, we can think of ourselves as not somebody who's raising horses or raising cattle or whatever type of livestock you have, but think of yourself as a pasture farmer, a grass farmer. And every good farmer knows about a few things. They know about their crop, they know about their harvester, and the harvester in this case is going to be our animals. They know about the soil, they know about confinement areas, and they know about irrigation. So we're going to talk about those 5 points right now. So we're growing grass as grass farmers, and we need to know about our crop. So if we were in person, I'd be quizzing you guys and asking you what you knew about how grasses grow. But so the leaves on grass plants are like solar panels. That's how I like to think of them. And basically they take chlorophyll and sunlight and they photosynthesize. And that's how they make their food for themselves. And then they store that food in the bottom part of the grass plant as well as in the roots. And the grass plant needs at least 3 to 4 inches of solar panels to keep manufacturing food. So those overgrazed pictures that we showed in the beginning, those grass plants didn't have enough solar panels to manufacture any food for themselves. So when that happens, they turn to their roots. Their roots act like a bank account. And when they manufacture food from their solar panels, when they have extra non-structural carbohydrates, that's the food and the sugars, it goes to their roots, and that's where they store their extra food. So I think of it as a bank account. If they don't have enough solar panels to manufacture more food, they have to go to their bank account. And when they take from their bank account, their roots get shorter and shorter. And pretty soon they're cashing checks that they don't have money for in their bank account. And I'm sure you all have seen horses or other livestock pull out grass plants from the root. I mean, pull the plant out and the whole root comes with it. And we're going to look in the next slide at how long roots should actually be. I'm just checking to make sure I got everything I want to cover about how our grass plants grow. Oh yeah, grass plants are cool season plants. They actually like this kind of weather that we've been having this spring, which has been cooler than normal and rainier. So that the best seasons for grass plants are really the spring and the fall. That's when they grow the most vigorously. Okay, so here is the next part I want to talk about with grass plants. So we talked about their roots being like their bank account. And if we were in person, I would have asked you guys before this slide to guess at how long roots should actually be. And in the picture on the right-hand side, the photograph, that horse, as you can probably imagine, is actually pulling up the grass plants completely by the roots. And that's because there's no more solar panels to manufacture food anymore, and their roots have become reabsorbed. But actually, healthy grass plants should have or will have roots that are at least 2 feet long or longer. In fact, like alfalfa has roots, can have roots up to like 20 feet long. And that all is because those plants have not been overgrazed. So check out this picture. I think it's just amazing. So what you have here is not an overgrazed pasture on the right-hand side, but that's an annual crop. It's wheat. And because it's harvested every year, its roots don't have an opportunity to grow longer. Whereas on the left, you have a native prairie, and they've pulled out they pulled a bunch of grass there, and they've washed its roots so that you can actually see how long they've washed the soil out. So you can actually see how long the roots are, and they're longer than 6 feet. And when you have long roots like that, I mean, you can just imagine in those two pictures, which example is going to be able to survive a drought better, or is going to be able to get nutrients, or is going to be able to filter out sediments or water that's running through it. And it's going to be the ones on the left-hand side. So that we want to strive for having longer roots like that, at least 2 to 4 feet. And the best way to do that is by not overgrazing. Okay, still talking about our crop. And let's talk about how to take care of our crop in the wintertime. So a lot of times that's when we see our pastures get abused, is in the winter. And the problem is if you overgraze it in the wintertime, they're not going to have solar panels to manufacture their food in the spring, and it'll again cause the root reabsorption. The other thing in the wintertime is if you got a lot of snow or a lot of rain and your soils are wet, soils are actually about 50% oxygen. And when something heavy stands on the soils, it compresses the soils and it pushes the air out of the soils and compacts it. And that makes it harder for the plants to breathe. And again, they breathe through their roots. You would think they breathe through their leaves, but they actually breathe through their roots. So they need to be able to have oxygen in the soil. And if it's been compacted and all the air bubbles have been pushed out of it, then they're going to start suffocating. And that's any kind of plant, by the way. That's trees all the way down to grass. So what this means is in the winter, we want to be careful with how we manage our pastures. And if they are saturated, we don't want to have animals or anything heavy on them. And then also in the wintertime, we want to continue to not graze below 3 to 4 inches. The next point about being a grass farmer is talking about our harvesters and how your animals graze. So we have a real variety of livestock owners in this class, and all livestock actually graze grasses differently. Like cattle prefer to have longer grass, and they prefer to wrap their teeth around the grass or their tongue around the grass and pull it or rip it. Which is part of the reason why when pastures are overgrazed by horses or sheep, cattle can actually starve on it because they can't get the grassy material off of it. And it's why we had the range wars back in the early 1900s and 1800s. So horses are selective grazers. I'll talk about horses a little bit because I saw there were a few people in the audience who have horses. And what it means about what a selective grazer means is that they only like to eat some things, and they like to move around. They're grazers instead of browsers. Livestock that are browsers are goats and llamas and alpacas. They'll eat shrubs. They'll eat things up high all the way down to things down low. So horses have a highly developed sense of taste, and they really like the sweet stuff. So left to their own devices, they will actually selectively overgraze an area so they can get down to the really sweet stuff at the bottom of the grass plant. And so the tall fibrous stuff is more like a bran muffin for them, whereas the little stuff is candy bar. And hence why I call the overgrazed pasture a candy bar pasture. In the wild, they wouldn't have something that looks like this. A horse would not. In the wild, it would be rangeland, and they'd have, bunch grass. So they'd have one bunch of grass here and one bunch of grass over there, and they'd have to walk in between, 20 feet or 100 feet or 300 feet to get to the next bite of grass. Whereas, now what we have are, basically like a smorgasbord where they've got all they can eat right in front of them all the time. And left to their own devices, horses will eat 18 to 20 some hours a day. Nature designed them like that because nature didn't design them to live on an improved pasture like this. Nature designed them to live in rangeland like what's here where I live. All right, so you want to think about your harvesters, your animals, and how they graze, and take that into consideration. The next thing to talk about is the dirt, which is our soil. And there's two ways to learn more about soil. So first of all, what I want to say in this picture here, you can see that the topsoil layer is pretty shallow there underneath those trees. And that's primarily the case for a lot of areas, except for people who live in like the Midwestern states where their topsoil is like 20 feet deep. But in lots of the United States, topsoil is pretty shallow. And if you want to have pasture, you've got to protect that topsoil. It takes someplace in the neighborhood of 100 years to 500 years to create 1 inch of topsoil. So it's really important to know about your topsoil and your soils and to know what their health is, as well as to protect them and take care of them if you want to have pasture. So the first way to learn more about your soil is through something called the Web Soil Survey. And your conservation district can help you with this. They are experts on knowing about the Web Soil Survey. It's a site on the internet that is run by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they are part of the USDA. And the NRCS has mapped out all of the soils in all of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii and Guam. And it's accurate up to about 5 acres. It's amazingly accurate. And looking up your soil survey for your property is kind of like getting the horoscope for your property. It's going to tell you about so much stuff about your property. It's going to tell you about, like if your soil's got a lot of organic material in it, if it's loamy, if it's rocky, if it's poorly drained, if it's well drained. And all those kinds of things make a big difference if you're building property or if you want to have pasture. It even makes a difference, like if you have to put a well in, it'll tell you about your soil as far as if you want to have a well and where groundwater might be. So that's one way. And all you have to do is Google web soil survey. And when you get to that site, you just need your address and you can get started and get lots of different information. Okay, and the next thing that you want to do is get your soil tested. And your conservation district, again, can help you with this. And I might mention that there's, I don't know if we said this in the beginning, but conservation districts, there's a conservation district in every county in the United States. And some counties, like Whitman County, has 2 or 3 conservation districts. But they're, just to reiterate then, they're non-regulatory and non-enforcement, and they're just there to provide education and technical assistance. And helping with soil testing is one of the things they can do. Extension can also help you, and you can find your extension office by looking up your land grant university for your state and Googling that, and then Googling that and your county, and you can find your extension office. As well as NRCS, so that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they can also help you with soil testing. And the soil test will tell you if your soil needs fertilizer and how much, and what kinds. And it can also tell you about other soil amendments that you might need, like compost or lime. What you do is you get a small amount of soil from your property and you mix it up, and then you take out an even like a cup or a half a cup and you send it in and to a lab, and it's very inexpensive. It's like $25 or less if your conservation district has any kind of cost sharing to help with that. And they then will send back information that tells you about your soil and what you can do to make it better for growing pasture or hay or whatever crop you're going to be growing. Oh, and the one other thing I wanted to mention about that, you know, if you're going to be adding fertilizers, we always recommend that you get a soil test before you do that, because people can't, even a soil scientist can't look at a pasture and say, oh, you need X amount of fertilizer. And if you put on too much, it just runs off and can cause water quality problems. And it's a waste of money. So that's why we really encourage people to get soil tests. Okay, your fourth point as a grass farmer is to know about the confinement area. So all livestock needs to have a confinement area in order to manage their pasture. And the reason why is that your confinement area is the heart of your pasture management. So like in this picture, in order to keep the pastures from getting overgrazed, you put them in this confinement area so that your pastures never get grazed below 3 to 4 inches. And this is also where you keep them in the wintertime when your soils are soggy and your grass plants are dormant and not growing, so that you don't overgraze and compact your soils in the wintertime. And it's also where you're going to keep your horses, particularly for horses, so that they don't get fat on too much pasture. So some quick examples of confinement areas. I'll show you horse ones as well as other livestock. So a few points that you want to think about with a confinement area is it's best if you can put it in a high, well-drained area. And that's so that, the confinement area is a heavy use area and the soil gets compacted so it doesn't drain anymore, and water is going to run off of it. And you want the water that runs off of it to go into vegetation like in this picture, the water that runs off of this confinement area goes into the pasture. Whereas if you had this in a low area, it would just collect water like a soup bowl. So you want it to be in a high, well-drained area with vegetation below it, and you want it to be convenient for chores so that it's easy for you to get in and clean, pick up manure on a regular basis, and feed and water your horses or livestock. Here's an example of a small acreage cattle confinement area that she used, a heavy use area. And she's got rubber stall mats and a cement pad in front. And here's a confinement area for alpacas, and it has gravel footing in it, and they pick up the manure regularly, and they have pasture on either side that they can allow their alpacas out onto the pasture. Here's a another confinement area for alpacas and llamas, and they have a shelter, they have footing in this paddock, and then they then they can turn their animals out into the pastures which are nearby. Here's a confinement area for sheep in the winter time. This picture was taken just at the beginning of spring. One for goats. This one has footing in here, hog fuel of crushed or of wood products. And in all of these pictures, you know, they manage manure in different ways. If you can pick up the manure like they are doing in this picture, and like we saw in the alpaca pictures, it makes a lot of difference for reducing mud. Here's another cattle picture, and she's got sand footing in this picture. She picks up the manure on a regular basis. She's got gutters and downspouts to keep rainwater, to divert rainwater away, clean rainwater, and not allow it to create more mud in this paddock or to get contaminated with mud and manure. Okay, so when do we use a confinement area? We use a confinement area during the rainy season, which would be the winter, or whenever the pastures are saturated. So that could be when you're irrigating during the storm event. And we want to keep our horses and livestock off of pasture during these times so we don't compact the soil and push all those air bubbles out of the soil so that the plants can't breathe. We use the confinement area in the wintertime when our pastures are dormant. I love this picture because it shows that it doesn't matter what size the operation, they still need and use a confinement area or a heavy use area. And this farm, their cattle are out on the hills in the spring and the summer, and they rotate them between different pastures, but they bring them in the wintertime into this heavy use area, because if they had their cattle on those hills in the wintertime, it would overgraze it. And when it would rain and when the snow would melt, you would get you know, a huge amount of runoff and soil erosion that would be coming down towards the farm. And you use a confinement area in the summer when you need to let your pastures rest and regrow to help avoid anything getting overgrazed. Yeah, and same thing here. Anytime, use a confinement area any time of the year to avoid overgrazing, like this picture is. And you use it so that you don't end up with an overweight individual, like this guy who's on the candy bar pasture. Okay, and my fifth point to talk about for being a grass farmer, it is to talk about irrigation. And that's particularly important in when we're concerned about it being a particularly droughty year, and when we're looking at climate change and potentially less rainfall. So the point with irrigation is when you are irrigating, you want to just water your pastures or any of your landscape so that it's wet to a depth of 5 to 6 inches. You don't want it, you want it to get deep, and you don't want to just get the surface. And the way you can test if it's damp down to 5 to 6 inches is either with a shovel or with a long-handled screwdriver that you use just for this purpose. If it's easy to push them into the ground, then you've gotten it wet and wet enough. But if you can't, then it's still too dried out, and you're going to need to irrigate longer. So how often you irrigate is going to depend on the type of crops that you have, the grass, the pasture species that you have, the weather, your soil type, and how much use, and if your pastures are overgrazed or not. The more overgrazed they are, the more frequently you're going to have to irrigate, because the more they'll dry out. So you can have your plants tell you as well when they need water. They start to change color. They turn from bright green to more of a grayish or bluish green color. And then they exhibit what's called footprinting. And that means when you walk on the plant and make a footprint, it's not as likely to be as resilient and pop back up. So you want to go as long as possible between waterings without making your plants go into water stress. And you want to water deeply and infrequently so that you develop good, strong roots. The frequent watering, like every week, means that your grass plant doesn't have to get roots that are very long. It's like, yeah, why work at this? The water comes to me right at the surface, so I'm not going to develop any more roots. So deep, infrequent watering develops stronger roots. Okay, so now we're ready to put it all together. So in the spring, you want to begin grazing your pastures gradually, particularly even for cattle, but particularly for horses. Horses are very sensitive, and basically for all livestock, what you want to consider is the good bacteria in their gut, and it needs to change. The bacteria has to change in order to have new food in the process and break it down. So you have to give the gut time to adjust. So with horses, what we say is start with 1 hour a day and work up to several hours over a period of weeks. And for cattle, you can maybe talk to your veterinarian to see what they recommend, but it's the same for cattle as well, that changes need to be made gradually. Ruminants are less sensitive than horses, but they're still sensitive. Okay, so you don't want to put any animals out on pasture unless the grass is at least 6 to 8 inches tall. And then you want to remove them from any area once it's grazed down to 3 to 4 inches. That bottom 3 to 4 inches belongs to the grass plant. Above that belongs to you as the grass farmer, but the bottom 3 to 4 inches belongs to the plant, and you got to be careful to not take from the plant, or it's going to become less healthy. And then after you've grazed an area down to 3 to 4 inches, you remove your animals and you mow, you harrow, and then you let it rest and regrow back to 6 to 8 inches before you put animals back on that area. And I'll talk about mowing and harrowing a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so rotational grazing is the best way to manage a pastures and manage our harvesters so that we get the most productivity and keep our pastures as healthy as possible. So the way that you do rotational grazing is, in a nutshell, is basically you divide it into sections. And even for small acreage, you can divide your pastures up. I have actually seen, like, oh gosh, I think it was a half-acre piece that was divided in half, and they did a great job managing that. And we actually, in Washington, we had one pasture that was, yeah, it was a half an acre, and we divided it into thirds, and it was probably one of our favorite pastures. It was quite easy to manage that way. So I think I can use my pointer. Yes. So in the upper left-hand side, so here's your heavy use area or your confinement area, and here's your pasture. And you can just envision this as being any size at all. These could each be 1/4 of an acre, or they could each be 2 acres, or they could each be 5 acres. Depends on how many animals and how much land you have and how well they get along with each other. Sheep and cattle and goats get along in big herds, whereas horses don't necessarily. So you start out by each day putting your animals out onto the first area and letting them graze it down for the allotted amount of time. If you're just starting out, you know, it's just going to be an hour or a couple hours. And then they go back into their heavy use area. And then they go back out here the next day and then back in. And then once this is grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, then the next time you turn them out, you put them on this area. And they graze this each day. And then once this is grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, then the next day when you put them out, they go here. And once this gets grazed down, then hopefully this has had a chance to grow back, and you can start here and put them back here. So the same thing down here in the lower right-hand side. This drawing is called, is often referred to as a wheel and spoke setup, and it's an extremely chore efficient way to do it. If you have an opportunity to set your place up like this, it would be awesome, because the way it works is this is your heavy use area, your confinement area, your paddock, and then your pieces like a pie pasture are coming off of that. And it could be, you could have 4, or you could have 6, or you could have whatever. You could have 10. And you have a gate here, and you start out by putting your animals out in this area for their allotted amount of time, 1 or 2 hours in the beginning. And each day you put them out, and then you bring them back in after they're done grazing. And then once this area is grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, the next day, this is the area they go out on. And then so forth and so on. And by the time you're done with pasture area 4, hopefully paddock area 1 has grown back up to 6 to 8 inches, and you can start back here. So in this manner, you're using your animals more like a harvester, and you're using them more intensively. So let's look at some practical examples of this. So this is one of my friend's properties in Western Washington, and I really liked how she did this. And so this is her, you know, barn. These are her paddocks. So this is her heavy use area, her confinement area. And then she had this kind of a, for lack of a better word, like a mixing area. So she would open up each paddock and let her horses into here. And then from here, she had divided her pastures into 3 sections. And her pasture wasn't that big. I guess I'd say it was about 5 acres total. And then she had a laneway up to this area here, this mixing area, and she could just open it up here and let her horses out into that pasture, whichever one she wanted. So she'd do this for a few days or a week until the majority of it was down to 3 to 4 inches. And then the next time she'd use this one. And then she'd keep doing that for a while until the majority was grazed down to 3 to 4 inches. And then she'd use this one. So hopefully that's making sense. Here is our property, and the way that we do it on ours is we have one pen with, so Anita in the last picture, she's got permanent fencing here, but we've got temporary fencing because we hay our pasture. So we couldn't put in permanent fencing in it. I mean, we could, but then we couldn't hay it. So what we do is we have a fence charger and a portable one, and then temporary fencing. And we just move this little pen around, and that's what our horses go in each day. And we have like 12 horses here, but there's only 3 of our horses that are able to go out and pasture. The other ones are of ours, are Mustangs, and they tend to get overweight really easily, so we can't put them out on pasture. So we have 3 quarter horses that go out, and we move this around this pasture area. So for example, maybe we start here and we graze this for 3 or 4 days. You know, we put them out for like 2 hours or whatever they've worked up to. And then when this area has been grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, then we move the pen so that it's here. And then when that's grazed down, then we move the pen that it's here. And then we move the pen that it's here. So we just move it around the pasture. And it's like every 3 or 4 days that we have to move it. And this is the alpaca place that I showed some other pictures. So they have their heavy use area here. This is actually an arena or an exercise area. And then they have different pastures, and they can move them through gates that way, or they have kind of a laneway where they can push them through. And that's how they utilize their different pastures and do rotational grazing. You can do this with all livestock. I love this picture of chickens because she was pasturing her chickens. They're eating the grass, and she has a lot of chickens. I can't remember how many, 30 or 50 maybe. And she would basically is basically doing rotational grazing with her chickens. So she has a little portable chicken coop there, and every so many days when the pasture is grazed down to 3 to 4 inches, she moves her chickens, the fencing, the temporary fencing, and that's electric too. She moves it on and moves her chickens on. So she does rotational grazing and pasture management with her chickens. And I've seen people do it with pigs too, pastured pigs. So the golden rule of pasture management that you need to remember is that the bottom 3 to 4 inches belongs to the grass plant. And if you want to have good pastures, you can't graze below that 3 to 4 inches. I always recommend that people get a yardstick or a ruler of some sort and literally walk out into the pasture and figure out what 3 to 4 inches is, so that you know when you need to take your livestock off, and then figure out when 6 to 9 inches is, so you know how tall the grass needs to be before you can put your livestock out on the pasture. And you also don't want to let your grass plants go to seed. And that's because your grass plant is spending its whole life trying to go to seed. And once it goes to seed, it's like, okay, my job's done for the year. I'm going to kick back and put my feet up, and it goes dormant. So it's not going to be as nutritious for your animals. So if you can't use your harvesters to graze your grass so that it doesn't go to seed, you're going to have to mow it. And so you want to mow it and keep it in the vegetative stage and not in the reproductive stage of plant life. Okay, so let's talk about some of the tools that you need to manage your pasture. Mowers, there's all different kinds of mowers. So we've just mentioned, I mean, our harvesters are a mower. And I've had people say, well, you know, I've got my horse to do the harvesting, you know, why do I need a mower? And it's so that your pasture doesn't get ahead of you. I mean, it may be that maybe you have a small enough pasture that's not the case. I've seen people manage their pasture with a weed whacker. So it just depends on how much you have and what your situation is. But so the upper right-hand side, that is like the smallest tractor known to man, and the smallest pasture mower. So that combination is good for small acreage. It's a pain in the butt if you have anything much bigger than a couple of acres. Like our 6-acre pasture, it's way too small for that, but it's what we got. And then for small acreage, you can also use a riding lawnmower. We usually call these a garden tractor. And you want to, if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that the underbelly mower can go high enough so you can take it out on a pasture. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's going to mow it too short, and you're going to be hitting molehills and rocks. And then there's also pull behind mowers, like in the bottom right-hand side. So these are gas powered like a lawnmower, and you can pull them with any kind of 4-wheel drive vehicle. I mentioned harrows before. A harrow is basically a drag. And what a harrow is going to do is drag the manure in the pasture. The manure that's out in the pasture, you want to spread it so that you're spreading out the nutrients from the manure, so that they're not concentrated and so that they're not smothering the grass plants. So the picture on the left-hand side, that's a tine harrow. It's got the little teeth on it, and it'll help break up manure. The bottom right-hand side, I've seen a lot of homemade harrows that work quite well. They're basically a piece of chain link fence attached to a board. And then you just put a chain on that, and you can pull it with any kind of 4-wheel drive vehicle. And you might want to throw a tire on it or something, a pallet, something like that for a little extra weight. But what you want to be doing is dragging the rough. Horses in particular will create a rough. They urinate and defecate, particularly defecate in one area, and concentrate all the nutrients that way and smother the grass plant. So you always want to be, they always are wanting to create a rough, and you always want to be uncreating the rough by harrowing it. Manure spreaders. Oh, good. I do have I forgot I had a picture here. So there's basically 2 different kinds of manure spreaders. There's ones that are ground driven, and there's ones that are PTO driven, and I'll explain that. So ground driven means that when you pull it, the wheels turn the mechanism that kicks the manure out. And so it's not powered at all. And ground driven manure spreaders can come in all different sizes. You can get quite small ones, like smaller than the bottom right-hand side, and you can get a little bit larger than the one at the top. PTO driven manure spreaders usually are bigger than this one, and they can be quite big, like on dairies, they're huge. So PTO stands for power takeoff, and that's something that you have to attach to the tractor. So right here, that's the PTO on the tractor. And that means you can turn it on and off, and it powers how fast you spread it. So we had this small PTO manure spreader, which we were grateful to have. We had it for, oh man, like 20 years. And but the problem with it is you have to hook it on hook. Unless you have 2 tractors, you have to hook it on hook all the time to spread, to spread and then to load the compost. So it takes a lot of work. Plus, hooking up a PTO is not the easiest thing in the world. and I could never really get it done too well. So we got this ground-driven manure spreader, and we only have one tractor, so we actually pull the manure spreader with our Ford Explorer, which looks really funny out in the pasture, but it works quite well. And then it's nice because you can listen to the radio or stay warm in the car, or have the air conditioning on when you're doing that. So guidelines for spreading compost. You want to apply compost only during the growing season when your plants are growing and they can use it. You want to apply it to pastures, lawns, gardens. Basically, the way you want to think of applying it is just apply it in a thin layer, like 1/4 of an inch, and no more than 3 to 4 inches total per year in the same place. And most of the time, unless you have a high stocking rate and not a lot of pasture, it's not usually a problem as far as having too much compost. And I wanted to talk just for a minute about why compost is important and why you need it for your pastures, and how it helps the big picture. So compost, a lot of times people think of it as a fertilizer, and it's really not so much a fertilizer as it is a soil amendment. It has micro and macro nutrients in it, and it has microbial life. That's probably one of the most important things. It's got beneficial bacteria and fungal organisms that help the soil. The organics in the compost act like time-released fertilizer. So it's small amounts of nutrients over a period of many years, actually. And the organics also help hold moisture. So it's going to help get you through droughty periods with your pasture by holding moisture like a sponge, basically. And it's an important part that we talk about with climate change. So science and research shows us that compost makes plants healthier, more disease resistant. It makes fruits and vegetables brighter colored and tastier. It's just amazing stuff, and really important to utilize at this time when we're talking about climate change and droughts and other issues like that. So that brings us to our last slide, and how we manage our pastures and our animals. And these different points about being a grazing or a grass farmer is going to make a big difference for our horses and our livestock, for livestock health, for the productivity of our pastures and our farms. It's going to help save us money when we have more productive pastures. It's going to help get us through droughty times and conserve water. It's going to help reduce climate change, and it's going to help conserve and protect water quality as well. So I have a few resources listed for me, for Horses for Clean Water. I have an email list and a newsletter, and you can go to my website, and I think actually in the next slide, I have a sign up QR code for how you can sign up for it. So I'll give you that in a second. And I'm also on social media, Horses for Clean Water, as well as Alayne Blickle. I write for thehorse.com, which is like it's about the equivalent of a professional journal. It's associated with the American Association of Equine Practitioners. So it's a really high quality magazine about the horse industry and horse keeping. I also do consultations, and then Sweet Pepper Ranch, we have a website for our ranch, and it can be a resource for you as well if you're traveling with horses or looking for improving horsemanship skills. And here's my QR code to sign up for the newsletter. And I think that's it. Gary